The sound did not echo. It came, and it was gone. No lingering trace, no fading repetition, no ghost of itself returning. It simply existed for a breath and then it wasn't there anymore. It was the kind of sound you might miss if you weren't paying attention. Not loud, not sharp, not drawn out. It made no demand. It made no mark. It was not even quite a note, just a movement in the air. A soft displacement of silence. And the silence welcomed it, accepted it, folded around it without resistance, as if the silence had been waiting not to be broken, but to be brushed. The way a surface waits not for a hand to press, but to hover near. A nearness, rather than a touch. That's all the sound was. And then it was gone. There are places where sound travels, where a single word tossed into space returns again and again, bouncing off stone and hollow, reshaping itself as it comes back. But this was not the kind of place. Here, the sound was absorbed instantly, taken in and not repeated. A place where nothing echoed, not because of emptiness, but because of depth. The room or the space, rather, because calling it a room feels too specific, had the kind of quiet that has felt more than heard. A stillness so complete that you began to notice your presence in it. The sound of your breathing became a companion. The shuffle of your coat, the quiet stretch of a muscle, these were the loudest things in the world here. And yet even they seemed hesitant, softened by the air, as though trying not to disturb what had settled long before you arrived. When the sound came, it didn't surprise me. It was not sudden. It rose into the space like a thought that had already existed and simply took its turn being noticed. A single note from a wind chime, a distant door, the soft strike of something dropped, not heavy, not sharp, just enough to be real. But what mattered more was that it did not echo. It did not repeat. It did not call attention to itself. The air seemed thick with time, not in a suffocating way, but as though it had gathered every hour and held it without urgency. Light filtered in not directly, but through something else. Frosted glass, perhaps, or a window to hide a see-through. The light had weight, though. It landed gently, slanting, giving shape to dust motes and edges and old floorboards. There were no harsh lines, only suggestions. Corners blurred, shadows moved, but slowly. You could almost believe that the sound was never meant to be heard at all, that it had been made without intention. A sound not directed outward, but simply released. And in that release, it found the quietest kind of freedom. It did not need to return. It did not need to linger. It had done what it came to do by existing only once. In a world where repetition is often mistaken for meaning, where things must echo, must amplify, must return again and again to be remembered, this was something else entirely. A sound that lived and died in the same breath. That trusted the space enough not to need a second chance. It made you wonder about the other things that didn't echo. Thoughts spoken under breath. The final exhale of someone who'd gone to sleep with the window open. The crackle of a fire burned low, just before it faded to ash. The first word of an apology that never found the rest of its sentence. You began to notice, in that space, the difference between loudness and presence. The sound had not echoed, but it had been. Completely, quietly, and without apology. It didn't fill the space, but it didn't shy from it either. It had no ambition, no reach. It stayed close to itself, and that, somehow, made it even more real. There was a chair in the room, plain, worn smooth in the arms, as though someone had sat there for years, not speaking, listening, perhaps, or just being. The chair didn't groan when you touched it. It accepted the weight. The floor beneath it didn't creak. Everything here had long since learned how to hold itself without complaint. A book lay nearby, its cover closed, its spine relaxed into the table beneath it. Dust along the edges, but not untouched. Someone had turned the pages. Someone had paused. Maybe here, maybe long ago. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the room had accepted it. The sound of those pages, once turned, had not echoed either. They had whispered, folded into time, and remained only as a kind of scent, like the memory of paper and patience. Some sounds do not echo because they are too small, others because they are too final. This was something in between. There was a clock somewhere. You couldn't see it, but you knew it was there not because it ticked, but because time was behaving. Time was moving forward carefully, respectfully, without pushing. Every second arrived without announcing itself. Every moment passed without resistance. The sound had come and gone within time like a boat crossing a still lake. A ripple, but no weight. What stayed with you after was not the sound, but the space it left behind. The air didn't rush to fill the absence. It held it gently, as if honoring the moment. That something had happened here, not something grand, not something loud, but something true. And truth does not always echo. Sometimes it only appears once, and that is enough. You began to wonder if the absence of echo was a kindness, a way of letting things go. A sound that echoes may ask to be heard again and again, but this sound asked nothing. It did not plead to be noticed. It did not leave behind a trail. It had no memory of itself. Only you remembered, and maybe that was the point. You could leave the room and return, and still the sound would not come again. It was not reproducible. You couldn't recreate the exact movement, the exact timing. You could drop the same object, touch the same surface, but the silence would catch it differently. The light would shift. The space would respond in a new way. There would be no perfect repeat. There never is. But some part of you carried it, even so. Not the sound itself, but the shape it left. A kind of imprint in your perception. Like a footstep that disappears but leaves a change in the soil. Like warmth from a hand long after it has left your own. The sound did not echo in the room, but it might echo, just faintly, in you. Because some things are not meant to bounce off walls. They're meant to go inward. And so you stood there for a while, not expecting anything, not listening for more. Just being in the space that once held a sound and no holds the memory of it. The stillness deepened. Or maybe it was you who deepened. It's hard to tell. Stillness does that. It folds you in until you forget where your thoughts end and the room begins. Eventually, you left. The door opened without creaking. Your footsteps didn't echo either. And behind you, the room did not change. But somewhere, perhaps far away, a wind passed through the branches of an old tree. It made a sound, and that sound did not echo. It, too, trusted that it had been enough. Birds did not startle. That was the first thing you noticed. Though it took a moment to realize why it mattered, they didn't flinch, didn't scatter in a flutter of wings. They stayed, perched as they were on crooked fences, on sagging branches, on wires strung slack between forgotten posts. Their bodies held a patient stillness, their feathers smoothed tight against the morning breeze. They blinked slowly. They blinked like creatures who had nothing left to flee from, or perhaps nothing they considered worth fleeing. It was not laziness, and it wasn't quite fearlessness either. It was something softer, quieter, as if they knew, somehow, that no one would intrude. As if the world had quieted enough to become background again, no longer something they had to dodge or defend against. No doors slammed, no sudden voices shattered the air. Even footsteps when they came were padded, muffled, and respectful. The birds did not startle because the world did not jolt. It flowed, slowly, like water under thick ice. Steady, measured. Predictable. There had been a time, perhaps, when every slight movement would have sent them into the air, feathers flaring, wings slicing space, a brief chaos of motion followed by disappearance. But that time had faded or settled into something older, something more like trust, not of humans, necessarily, but of the moment itself, of its lack of urgency, of its gentleness. In this place, even stillness was an active thing. It wasn't just the absence of movement, it was a presence, a decision. The birds did not startle because nothing here arrived violently. Every change arrived the way a shadow grows across stone, gradually, without edge. The light didn't strike, it stretched. The air didn't shift, it folded. Time didn't pass, it settled in. And so the bird stayed. A jay nestled into a divot in the rooftop, eyes half closed, as though it had been waiting for the morning light, not with anticipation, but with calm expectation. A sparrow twitched its foot against the bark of a tree that had stood since before the fence was built. then tucked its head back under its wing. Even the blackbirds, so often restless and loud, moved as if they had all the time in the world. They didn't chorus, they conversed. To say the birds didn't startle is to say the air itself had forgotten how to startle. There were no sharp lines, no harsh arrivals. The very temperature moved like breath. You might walk through it and find no sudden gusts, no shifts that made you flinch. Everything was paced, and there's something profound in that, because birds are the first to react. They are nature's barometers responding to the slightest flicker of disturbance. If birds do not flee, it means nothing has screamed through the silence. No noise has broken the rhythm. No chaos has intruded. It is a kind of peace deeper than mere quiet. A peace that has lingered long enough to be believed. A peace the birds have grown used to. Perhaps there had once been children running through these fields, their joy scattering the flocks in bursts of motion. Perhaps once a dog had barked into the trees and sent birds into startled spirals. Perhaps once people had walked quickly, spoken loudly, dropped buckets, slammed shutters, and swept porches with unnecessary vigor. And the birds had flown, again and again, their calm constantly interrupted by our movements. But not now. Now, the stillness was old enough to have settled into the bones of the place, old enough to have been accepted, and the birds, wise in their instinct, had realized no one here wished to make a scene. The world moved softly, and so they stayed. There is something to be said for a world where birds don't startle. It tells you what kind of rhythm the day holds. What kind of person must you become to match it? You can't slam a door in a place like this. You can't speak quickly, or drop things, or stomp. You have to walk lightly, speak low, let your breath fall into pace with the hush. You become, in a sense, part of the background. Not because you're unimportant, but because importance here is measured by gentleness. Birds did not startle, and so, gradually, you learn to move the way they did, to blink slowly, to turn your head rather than snap it, to let silence fill the spaces where you might once have filled them with chatter or motion. You learn that stillness wasn't the absence, it was the shape of presence when it has done right, when it isn't screaming to be seen. Even the trees participated. They didn't sway so much as lean. The grass didn't rustle so much as exhale. The clouds didn't drift, they hovered as if they, too, were pausing for breath before continuing. It made you want to listen more, and the listening changed what you heard. You started to notice the smallest things. The slight shift in tone as a dove cooed. The delicate crackle of twigs drying in the sun. The moment a leaf gave up its grip and dropped, not with a thud, not with drama, but like it had simply decided it was time. You began to hear things you didn't know had sound. The hush of a wing adjusting, the scrape of claws repositioning, the whisper of a beak smoothing feathers. And in all that, not once did the birds startle. Not even when you walked beneath them. Not even when you sat nearby. As long as your movements held softness, they stayed. This kind of trust isn't given, it's grown. It takes days of quiet behavior, of not disturbing the order of things, for nature to accept you as part of it, for the birds to look at you not as a threat, but as something neutral, something natural, something they don't need to flee. There's a kind of dignity in being ignored by a bird. It means you've disappeared correctly. You've folded yourself into the hush well enough that you no longer register as danger. You've joined the background not in insignificance, but in harmony. Birds did not startle, and that changed everything. You began to understand that the world didn't need to be pushed to move. It would turn on its own. The sun would rise without alarm clocks. The light would shift without permission. The morning would arrive not in a rush, but in a slow unfolding. You could wait, and in that waiting, things arrived more clearly. You saw the moment a bird first lifted its head, the way it looked around not nervously, but with care. You saw it stretch one wing, then the other. You saw it hop once, not out of fear, but out of a simple decision. You saw what it meant for a creature to move without needing to escape. And maybe that's what made it matter most. The birds did not startle, because nothing here threatened to shatter the stillness. Because everything respected the slowness of the morning. Because nothing arrived with too much speed or force. Because even the day itself seemed to rise carefully. tiptoeing over the horizon like it didn't he want to wake anyone who hadn't he asked to be woken. And if that isn't peace, what is? The birds stayed. They blinked, they breathed, and they reminded you, without words, how to exist without disturbing, how to remain present without demanding space, how to share the air with everything else that needed it. You stayed, too, and together, you didn't startle. There were no tremors, no subtle shift beneath the soles of one's feet, no trembling of pebbles, and no slight unsettled hum rising from the earth. Just stillness. A quiet so deep it seemed to stretch into the dirt itself. You could walk across the field, and the grass might lean away from your passing, but the soil remained unmoved, undisturbed. It wasn't that the ground was hard or unwelcoming. It had its softness. Grass grew thick and springy in some places, and in others, it wore the smooth polish of years of footsteps. It was just that the ground no longer responded the way it once might have. In some distant past, maybe the earth had been a partner to motion. It had carried sound and vibration, echoed the thunder of hooves, or the rhythm of drums, or even the steady tread of deliberate steps. But that had been long ago. Now, nothing reached beneath the surface. Everything above still carried on, in its own slow, unbothered way. The wind moved through tall blades of grass, softening their posture but never quite tipping them over. Leaves danced on the edges of things. The sky rolled quietly from one shade to another, without dramatic transitions. Birds flew in arcs, landed, chirped, and flew again. There was rhythm, yes, but no impact. The ground didn't respond. It received but did not echo. It bore weight but didn't signal it. If someone walked across it barefoot, they might notice the subtle warmth of soil heated by the sun or the delicate coolness in the shade. They might feel the texture of small stones, the give of wet patches, or the feathery hush of moss. But they wouldn't feel anything more. No th or no pulse. Just the presentness of the ground and its deep silence. People used to talk about the earth as if it were alive, not just living, but reacting. There were myths of stones that could sing, of soil that remembered footsteps, of roots that could feel their way through not just space but story. Perhaps it was never literally true. Perhaps it only seemed that way because people once listened more closely. Or perhaps time had changed the world's attention. The earth had quieted not because it was empty, but because it no longer needed to reply. The ground didn't vibrate when someone cried. When grief made a person fall to their knees, the dirt received them without reaction. No trembling, no sympathetic shift, just a soft, passive acceptance of the weight. In that way, it was a comfort. It offered nothing but also didn't turn away. It allowed itself to be leaned into. It let itself hold whatever needed holding. A kind of silence that asked no questions. There had once been machines that tested for vibrations used for science, for safety, for understanding. They were sensitive, calibrated to register the faintest movement. But here, they would have registered nothing. No subtle pulse from deep below. No faint echoes from distant activity. Just a steady, unwavering stillness. The ground, in this place, had long since gone quiet, not dead quiet, but resting quiet, as if it had nothing left to say aloud. Even sound above the ground carried differently. Footsteps seemed to be swallowed quickly. Voices, if anyone spoke them, did not travel far. There was no reverberation, no bounce. A laugh might rise for a moment, then fold in on itself, vanishing as if it had never quite made it past the edge of breath. Not from eeriness, just from the soft refusal of the ground to play host to echoes. And in the absence of vibration, there came a curious calm. People found it difficult to rush here. Their pace slowed without their meaning to. Haste didn't take root in the body the way it usually did. Urgency faded into something less pointed. You could try to stomp to test if the earth would respond, but it wouldn't. Your energy would not come back to you. It would go down and simply stop. For some, that was unsettling. For others, it was relief. There is a kind of peace in knowing that not everything must respond. That you can place your weight upon something and it will not react, not flinch, not protest. The ground held your weight like a hand underwater, firm, quiet, and constant. It had been like this for a long time. No one really remembered when the last vibration had passed through this land. Maybe it had been during a storm, or a war, or a celebration long faded from memory. Perhaps there had once been marching here, or dancing, or the wild tremble of carts rolling over cobblestones. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it had always been this way, and the stories of vibration were only stories told to feel less alone in the stillness. In the village nearby, if it could still be called, that people rarely spoke of the ground. It was not feared nor revered. It was simply there, like the sky or the night. No one expected anything from it anymore. Children played without shaking it. Elders walked slowly and carefully, not because of the earth beneath, but because of the weight they carried in their bones. The ground received them all the same. Sometimes, someone would ask, "Why doesn't it vibrate?" But the question never lingered long. It passed like a breath through conversation, unanswered, unexamined, not from lack of curiosity, but from lack of urgency. The absence of vibration had become so steady, so dependable, that it no longer seemed strange. It just was. In old books, if you looked for them, you could find diagrams of seismic patterns, recordings of earthquakes, and descriptions of trembling fields and churning valleys. These books felt like science fiction here, not because the science was wrong, but because the sensation was unfamiliar. It was hard to imagine the ground rising up, shaking buildings, and moving stones. Here, the stones stayed where they were laid. Even time passed differently in a place where the ground didn't vibrate, not slower, exactly, not faster, either, just more softly. Without rhythm, without percussion. A clock would still tick, a heart would still beat, but the world itself gave no backbeat, no low murmur. The days unfolded like cloth, one after another, smooth and quiet. There was something sacred about it, though no one used that word. The lack of vibration didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like permission, as though the earth had said, very gently, "You don't need to be loud to be real. You don't need to be heard to matter. You don't need to make an impact every time you move." And in that silence, people listened differently. To birdsong, to breathe, to the tiny creaks of wooden floorboards, to the sound of ink scratching paper or water poured into a cup. The quiet made everything else a little sharper, a little more meaningful. There was no noise to blur the edges. You could sit on the ground, lean back, close your eyes, and feel nothing, but not in a hollow way. In a held way. The stillness beneath you was vast and patient. It would not shift to accommodate you. It would not rumble in response. It would simply be there, the way old things are, constant, unmoved. The ground didn't vibrate, and somehow, that was enough. The kind of phrase that doesn't shout its importance, but instead hums quietly with the weight of time. There was a bell, and once long ago someone was responsible for it. They woke each day, knowing that the act of ringing the bell was their task. It wasn't glamorous, nor perhaps particularly difficult, but it mattered. It had a place in the daily rhythm of things. A bell doesn't ring itself. It waits, patient and inert, until a hand sets it in motion. The person who did so is no longer here, but the bell remains. To imagine that person is to imagine a life built around small rituals. Maybe they lived nearby, in a cottage not far from the tower. Maybe the bell was atop a chapel, or nestled in a lonely watchtower where mountains met clouds. The person might have climbed stairs each morning, hand on the railing, body still shaking off the chill of sleep. Or perhaps they lived above the structure, waking mere steps away from their duty. Either way, the bell was their companion, a constant presence that expected little but offered much. The job of ringing it may have been tied to something specific, calling monks to prayer, warning villagers of a coming storm, or marking the time of day. Or perhaps it served no current function at all, but continued for the sake of tradition because it had always been rung at a certain hour. In that case, the bell ringer's role wasn't about utility so much as continuity, keeping the thread unbroken, holding space for something older than any single life. There's something sacred about that kind of task. It is not loud or glorious. It's not remembered in history books or etched into stone. But it matters. It is the sound of order, of familiarity, of things happening as they should. For those who heard the bell, its sound may have become invisible part of the background, dependable and barely noticed. And yet if it stopped, they would notice. They might not even realize why the morning felt off or the evening strangely incomplete. They would feel the gap before they understood it. And now, it doesn't ring anymore. Or if it does so only by the push of the wind, which is not the same. The wind rings things by accident. It stumbles into sound, but a person chose to ring it. Choose the time, the rhythm, and the tone. That distinction matters. Intent gives meaning. The bell without its ringer becomes something else, not silent necessarily, but aimless. To say it used to be someone's job to ring it is to acknowledge absence. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of purpose. Of the person who once made that sound part of their day. That person had a name, a history, maybe a family, maybe not. Maybe they rang the bell alone, with no one but birds and clouds for company. But either way, they existed. Their hands touched the rope or lever. Their ears heard the echo. Their heart may have beat a little faster with the first chime, not because of excitement, but simply because the body responds to rhythm, to movement, and to sound. Over time, their presence became part of the place. A tower that is rung daily becomes more than stone and metal. It becomes inhabited, even when empty. It listens. It anticipates. When the ringer does not come, it knows. It waits longer, still longer, and then still. There is a moment hard to pinpoint when waiting becomes abandonment. When the routine stops being interrupted and simply stops. The bell still hangs, but it is no longer part of a pattern. The job no longer exists. The bell remains, but the purpose has gone quiet, and perhaps the bell itself has changed. Metal changes when it is unused. It weathers, dust gathers in the cradle, the rope frays or disappears entirely. A bird might nest nearby, unbothered by the once mighty tone. Rust creeps like moss. What was once an instrument becomes a relic. Still beautiful, still imposing perhaps, but no longer active. Its silence is not peaceful, it is waiting, unresolved. There is tenderness in remembering that it used to be someone's job, not because the person was important in the grand sense, but because they were important to the bell, and to the place, and to the time. This job tethered them to the world in a specific way. Even if it was repetitive, even if it was boring, it was theirs. And now that they are gone, the space they filled remains like a ghost, not haunting, just unfinished. We live in a world that rarely notices such jobs. We celebrate invention, disruption, and ambition. But there is something profoundly human about a life made of repetitions. A life of showing up. A life where one's hand pulls the same rope every morning and lets the sound stretch out into the wind. That life doesn't end with a bang. It ends when the bell doesn't ring one day, and someone else, if anyone's left to notice, looks up, puzzled, wonders, and then returns to their own day. The silence settles in like dust. But if we sit with that silence, we begin to hear something else. Not sound, exactly, but memory. The idea that someone once stood here, that they took their job seriously, or maybe not, that they had good days and bad ones, that they were part of a long line of people doing quiet things that mattered to no one but everyone. And now their echo lives not in the bell, but in the knowledge that it used to be someone's job to ring it. Why did it stop? Perhaps they grew old, and no one came to replace them. Perhaps a war came, or a fire, or just a centerist. Maybe the town emptied slowly over time, and no one needed a bell anymore. Or maybe the bell tower itself was locked one day and forgotten. The details don't matter as much as the fact of the ending. Every ritual ends. Every task that becomes routine eventually reaches its final turn. The rope is pulled one last time. The chime fades, and then there is only air. Yet we can still imagine the sound. That is something we carry even after the physical act disappears. The bell rings in the mind. It takes on layers of meaning. It becomes more than noise. It becomes a reminder of all the invisible work done by hands now gone, of the ways people shape space through intention, of how sound creates belonging. The person who rang the bell may not have considered themselves remarkable. They may not have written a single thing down, but their action was recorded in the air, in vibration, in routine, in the memories of those who heard. There is a deep dignity in that kind of work, not celebrated, but steady. Not famous, but trusted. Now the wind moves through the tower. The bell hangs motionless or sways lightly. It has not been removed, not yet. No one has dismantled it, because perhaps it still holds something sacred. Or perhaps no one dares to climb that high anymore. The stairs creak, the hinges resist, and the room where the bell ringer once stood remains undisturbed, dust-covered. Yes, but intact. As if waiting. Sometimes, someone will look up at the tower and ask, "What was that for?" And someone else, perhaps older, will say, "There used to be a bell. Someone used to ring it, and that's all." No elaboration, just a passing note. But the sentence carries weight. It used to be someone's job to ring it. There's a kind of gravity to that, a recognition that time has passed, that people once lived and moved and worked in that space. Even now, if one were to stand close enough, the bell might still respond. A faint groan, a whisper of sound if the wind is just right, as if it, too, remembers, as if some part of it still longs to be rung, not for attention, not for noise, but simply to be useful again, to mean something, even once. We forget so many things, but sometimes we remember just enough. We pass by a tower. We see the shape of a bell, and something in us stirs, not because we miss the sound itself, but because we miss what it meant. Someone was here. They showed up. They rang the bell. They mattered not to history, perhaps, but to time, to place, to the sound that once cut through morning mist or evening stillness. It used to be someone's job to ring it, and that is enough to remember. There are moments in history when time is marked not by the sweep of clocks or calendars, but by the quiet endurance of objects. This line, "Generations passed, and still the bell stood," is one of those moments and observations so understated, and yet so resonant that it invites the listener or reader to pause, reflect, and settle into the silence it implies. On its surface, it merely notes the persistence of a bell, perhaps a church bell, a tower bell, or a relic of some ceremonial structure, but beneath this simplicity lies a vast, quiet commentary on the passage of time, the fading of human presence, and the quiet dignity of things that endure. A bell is a curious symbol. It is at once an instrument of sound and a relic of silence. When it rings, it calls attention. It demands notice, signaling the hour, announcing a death, marking a celebration, or warning of danger. But when it does not ring, when it merely stands, unmoved and unneeded, it becomes something else. It becomes memory itself. The silence of the bell is not empty. It is a silence steeped in all the sounds it once made and all the people who once responded to those sounds. That is what makes the image of the bell standing through generations so quietly powerful. It did not fall. It was not taken down. It was not replaced. It stood. What does it mean for something to stand while generations pass? It means that lives have begun and ended. Children have been born, grown old, and died without ever hearing it ring. Families have moved in and out of the town. Traditions have withered or been forgotten. The streets may have shifted, and the buildings may have crumbled or been rebuilt in new materials, in new styles, or not rebuilt at all. The bell, though, remains. It has become part of the landscape, not in a showy or deliberate way, but simply through its staying. The phrase generations past implies more than time, it implies layers. Each generation carries its own rhythms, its own hopes, failings, language, and rituals. The bell, once rung by hand or rope, perhaps pulled by someone who knew how to measure its weight and reverberation, becomes a point of quiet stability amid the churning of cultural and personal change. One can imagine it rusting slowly, collecting dust or lichen, or perhaps being kept clean out of habit more than need. Either way, It is no longer the center of attention. But it is there, still there. There is something deeply melancholic and peaceful in this entrance. It is not triumphant. It is not the result of grand preservation efforts or civic pride. It is quiet, like something forgotten by history, but remembered by the landscape itself. The bell stands not because someone decided it should be important, but because no one thought to remove it. Its relevance faded, its purpose dissolved, but the metal still holds shape, the frame still bears weight, and so, it stands. There is a kind of stillness in this that is not lifeless but full of a different kind of presence, one that does not ask to be looked at or understood. The bell, silent and unmoving, becomes a kind of clock that does not keep time in seconds or hours, but in the erosion of stone steps and the fading of painted wood, and in the slow inevitable retreat of ivy across a wall. It tells the story of what is no longer needed. It becomes an emblem of how the world moves on without ever fully clearing away the past. Think of what it once meant for that bell to stand. When it was first installed, there was likely an event people gathered. The bell lifted into place, its first notes ringing out into the town below. It would have been new, gleaming, and resonant. Perhaps there were children who thrilled at the sound. Maybe it marked morning prayers or called the town to assembly. Perhaps it rang for weddings and solemnly for funerals. Each tone would have echoed into the homes and hearts of those who lived beneath its reach. But then, slowly, subtly, the world changed. Perhaps the town thinned out. People moved elsewhere. The need for the bell diminished, and the hand that once pulled its rope no longer came. The tower remained. The mechanism stiffened. The clapper perhaps fixed in place by rust or simply by disuse. And still it stood. The bell's survival through generations is not just about physical endurance. It's about outlasting relevance. There is a quiet nobility in continuing to exist when you are no longer needed. Most things do not last this long. Most things are taken down, scrapped, recycled, or repurposed. But not the bell. The bell is too solid, too heavy, and too much trouble to move in, so it becomes a monument by accident, an unintentional relic. This accidental monumentality is part of what makes the image so soothing. The bell doesn't demand that anyone care about it. It doesn't ask to be remembered. It simply continues. There is something profoundly restful about that kind of endurance. In a world filled with change, with updates, upgrades, revisions, and erasures, to stand to simply remain is a radical act of stillness. If one were to imagine visiting the place where this bell stands, it might not even be immediately noticeable. It might blend into the architecture or sit quietly above a building no longer in use. Perhaps birds perch on it. Perhaps ivy climbs its mount. Perhaps on some rare day, someone climbs up and touches it, surprised that it's still there, or pulls at the rusted rope just to hear what sound, if any, remains inside. And if the bell still rings, it might sound different now. Not clear and bright, but low and strained, like a memory trying to speak through a throat that hasn't formed words in decades. Or perhaps it makes no sound at all anymore. Perhaps the clapper is gone or stuck, but that's not the point. The point is that it is there. In sleep-oriented storytelling, such an image works like a balm. It soothes by reminding us of continuity without drama. The world may move and shift, but some things persist not because they are strong, but because they do not resist the passage of time. The bell does not fight to be noticed. It does not resist rust or fading. It simply accepts, and in that acceptance is peace. The phrase also carries an echo of all the people who did not last. The generations passed. They lived and went. They told stories and buried others. They climbed the stairs where the steps had been worn to a depth. They lit candles in windows that are now dark. They startled birds that no longer notice footfalls. And still the bell stood. This contrast between impermanence and persistence is what gives the line its quiet strength. It does not mourn. It does not celebrate. It simply observes. And that, in many ways, is what restful writing can do. It offers the reader a place to stop striving, to observe without needing to react, to breathe. The bell standing also implies something about how memory works. We often imagine memory as active as something we must reach for, something we must grasp and hold on to. But sometimes, memory is passive. It is held in the objects we forget to remove, in the structures that outlive us, in the things we overlook until, one day, we notice them again and realize they have been there all along. Memory, like the bell, can simply be present. One can also reflect on the materiality of the bell. Its metal, perhaps bronze or iron, shaped in a foundry by people whose names are now lost. The artisans who made it, the workers who hoisted it, and the engineer who designed its placement all gone. And still, their work remains. It is a kind of posthumous collaboration, a message without words, transmitted through weight, shape, and silence. In this way, the bell becomes more than a fixture. It becomes a thread that ties the past to the present, even if the thread is frayed. It has no voice now, but it once did. It speaks not through sound, but through presence. And that presence is enough. Ultimately, generations passed, and still the bell stood as a lullaby of endurance. It offers a calm place to rest within the imagination, yes, but also within the emotional landscape of the listener. It assures us that not all things vanish, that some things simply remain, and that this quiet remaining can be beautiful in its own right. It is not an invitation to mourn or to seek meaning. It is an invitation to sit beside something ancient and still and let it be, and in doing so, we are reminded sometimes the most enduring things are the ones that no longer serve a purpose, but continue to offer a kind of comfort simply by being. There was a bell, and it had been there for as long as anyone could remember. It stood where the breeze could find it, suspended from a rust-worn bracket attached to a weathered frame, which itself leaned just slightly from years of quiet waiting. The metal had dulled with time, its original shine long overtaken by the slow oxidation of stillness. A small crack ran along the lower curve of its lip, but it had not widened in years. If anything, it had become part of the bell's identity, a silent mark of age rather than damage. No one had asked the bell why it was there. It wasn't a purposeful silence, not a rejection or a forgetting, exactly. More a kind of ambient indifference that had set in over decades. People passed it. Children noticed it only until they were old enough not to, and adults regarded it as they might an old tree or a stone in the path that had always been there. It had settled into the landscape with a patience that required no explanation, and because no one questioned it, it remained. There were once records, perhaps, or stories passed along around hearths about when it rang, what it meant, and who had once rushed to answer its call. But those stories had faded, fragmented into soft-touch rumors that no longer had the power to provoke curiosity. The bell had survived past the memory of its own relevance, and now it simply existed. In its way, it did so completely. It had no schedule to meet, no expectation to fulfill. It neither demanded attention nor seemed offended by its neglect. And still, no one asked. The rope attached to the clapper had long since frayed. What remained was curled like a sleeping animal at the base of the post, half buried beneath dust and leaves. There had once been a time when that rope was held tightly and someone's fist pulled sharply to send vibrations through the air that carried weight and urgency. Now, it merely rested. Even the wind didn't tug at it anymore. It had become to limp, to soak through with years of rain and resignation. No one knew what the bell sounded like. They imagined, perhaps, they might have stood near it and tried to picture the tone, whether it was low and mournful or clear and commanding, whether it had once heralded arrival or warned of danger, whether it had called to worship or to war. But the act of imagining was quiet and private, fleeting even. No one voiced these thoughts aloud. They came and went like dreams upon waking softly, without resolution. And still, no one asked. Not because they were forbidden to ask, but because they were trained by time not to. The bell had outlasted those who might have cared, and its silence had become self-reinforcing. There was a kind of social agreement unspoken and unnoticed that the bell simply was, and that was enough. The bell did not resist this. It did not protest or attempt to reclaim purpose. It did not rattle in the wind or groan beneath its own weight. It existed quietly, as things do when no one interrupts them. Perhaps someone, once, had meant for it to ring only in emergencies. Perhaps its voice had once marked the turning of hours or the changing of guards, or the tolling of some sacred rite. Perhaps someone had cared deeply, but no echo of that caring remained. The structure around it had changed. Walls had crumbled, paths had shifted, and even the sky above seemed less like the same sky that had once heard its sound. And yet, the bell remained. Still, no one asked. There was a kind of reverence in that lack of questioning, a respectful forgetting. It wasn't that the people were careless or uncurious by nature. It was just that the world had moved on without the bell, and the bell had not insisted on being followed. Other things had taken its place: newer signals, faster notifications, sounds that vibrated in pockets and lit up screens. The bell had never learned to compete. It didn't need to. There is something quietly powerful about a presence that does not explain itself. The bell's dignity came not from importance but from persistence. It stood through winters and sweltering summers, through storms that bent trees and quiet evenings where not even birds called. It collected dust and silence equally, and still it stood. People built lives around it, though never because of it. Children ran past it, their footsteps light on the stones nearby. Teenagers leaned against it, not out of interest, but simply because it was there and solid. Lovers once paused beside it under fading daylight, not because the bell blessed the moment, but because it provided something like a shadow, like a boundary between one part of their lives and the next. And still, no one asked. The silence around the bell was not suspicious. It wasn't ominous. It was calm and settled, like the hush of an old book unopened on a shelf. There were words inside it, surely, and meanings, but none that insisted on being known. The bell did not need a reader to validate its existence. It needed no audience to perform for. It did not measure its worth in tolls. Once, someone might have placed a hand on it just to feel its texture, to feel the coolness of metal warmed only slightly by the day's sun. That touch wouldn't have awakened anything. The bell would not have stirred. It did not hold grudges. It held time, and yet still no one asked. There were other sounds now: birds, distant engines. The hum of modern life crept even into forgotten corners. But those sounds passed over the bell like waves over a stone. They did not move it. It attuned itself to a different rhythm, one no longer measured by people. It knew waiting in a way few things do, without anxiety, without impatience. It waited not for someone to pull the rope or to restore its purpose, but because waiting was simply what it did. It had become its own still point, not a monument, not a relic, but something simpler, a fixture of the world that no longer needed to justify itself. Somewhere in the vast ledger of forgotten things, there might be a line noting why the bell had been forged, who had paid for its installation, and what its tone had been meant to signify. That page, if it existed, was buried deep beneath newer concerns, fresher ink, and more pressing matters. No one looked for it. No one needed to. And still, no one asked. The bell did not resent this. If anything, it seemed to appreciate the stillness it had been granted. Its voice had not been taken from it had merely not been requested. That is different. It had not been silenced. It had simply ceased being necessary. But even unnecessary things can be beautiful. Even unused things can be present. Sometimes, when the sky turned a certain kind of gray just before a storm, the bell looked heavier, like it remembered something, though it did not say what. Other times, when the sun hit it just right, the faint shimmer of old bronze suggested a light that had once drawn eyes. But no one remarked on these moments. They passed like all the others, without ceremony, without question. And still, no one asked. The bell's mystery was not dramatic. It did not provoke theories or myths. It was too quiet, too mundane in its placement. And that is why it endured. Had it drawn attention, someone might have decided to remove it, repurpose it, meld it down. Instead, it stayed because it blended. It stayed because it had mastered the art of staying without asking to stay. It is possible that one day, someone will stop and wonder. A true wondering, not a passing glance, but a pause. A pause that turns into a gaze, a thought, or reaching. They may look at the crack along the lip and wonder what made it. They may find the frayed rope and wonder who last held it. They may hear in the bell's silence a kind of invitation not to ring it, but simply to notice it. And still, even then, they may not ask, because some things are allowed to be, not explained, not reclaimed, just acknowledged. The bell did not need to be asked why. It did not need to be reminded of what it had been. It had stood through too much for any single question to define it. It existed not in spite of being forgotten, but in the quiet space that forgetting makes. And in that space, it waited, not for use, but for presence. Not for a reason, but for someone to stand beside it long enough to recognize it for what it was, a silence that had shaped a corner of the world, even if no one had asked it to. There are some things in this world that are allowed to linger long past their final moment of use, not out of necessity or reverence, but because no one remembered to let them go. The bell was one of those things. It still hung where it always had, in the stone tower that cast a sleepy shadow over the square below. Its surface bore the stains of rain and time, its edge dulled by seasons of wind and waiting. But it remained suspended, not broken, not gone, simply present. Whatever purpose it once held had slipped quietly from memory, like smoke curling through a half-open window and vanishing into nothing in particular. No one alive quite remembered what the bell was meant to do. There had once been records. They said ledgers, journals, carefully inked documents that described why the bell had been made, when it should ring, and what it should signal. But those were misplaced, not with drama or disaster, just shuffled out of reach by the ordinary drift of years. Maybe they had been boxed and shelved in some dusty room that itself was forgotten. Maybe they had been burned in a quiet fire no one took this seriously. Or maybe, like so many things, they'd simply stopped being needed and so ceased to be noticed. The bell remained, but the words about it did not. It had outlasted its explanation. And so, time went on, as it always did, softly. There was no jarring rupture, no urgent reckoning, just a long, low hush in which the bell stood untouched. People walked past it without glancing up. Children grew up with it as a fixture, like a tree or a lamp post, unquestioned and unbothered. It had become part of the scenery, part of the town's silent, inherited habits. The world around it changed in small and steady ways. Roofs sagged and were replaced. Stones wore down at the edges. Faces came and went, and still the bell kept its place. The past made no demands, and the present had no use for it. Down in the old shed near the West Road, the tools that once worked in tandem with the bell still waited. Their handles were cracked with age. Their metal rusted gently but not cruelly. They leaned against the walls like old men waiting for someone to ask them for a story. Once, the tools had belonged to the bell ringer, the one whose job it was to wind the ropes, check the gears, and polish the brass until it gleamed like a golden echo. But that job had dissolved into abstraction. Perhaps someone had last done it a generation ago, or two. The tools remained. They waited, patient and unused, not forlorn, not desperate. Simply still. They did not demand memory. They accepted dormancy without bitterness. The ground beneath the bell tower had not vibrated in years. That was a detail only the most sensitive might notice, someone who remembered the subtle tremor that came just before a sound rippled outward through the square, or the faint shiver that passed through stone when the bell reached its floor. Without the bell's deep voice, the earth remained still, not empty, just untroubled. There were no more signals to send, no urgent clamor for attention. The quiet had grown into the shape of permanence, and yet no one asked the bell why. It hung in plain sight, visible from windows and alleys, outlined against evening skies, and no one turned toward it with wonder or need, not out of disrespect, but out of a long, slow forgetting. Its presence asked nothing of them, and they asked nothing in return. There had once been a time when someone might have stood below it, shading their eyes, wondering what it meant or why it had stopped. But those moments had passed long ago, quietly dissolved into days that had no time for questions without urgency. The bell had become a background to ordinary life, and its silence had become ordinary, too. Still, the bell did not mourn. That would have required memory or desire, or some grasp of its own significance. But the bell simply was. It did not wish to be heard. It did not take long to be wrong. Its purpose had not vanished with violence, but had faded with grace. If anything remained inside it an echo, a resonance, it was not a cry for attention, but a quiet holding. It held the shape of its use, the curve of motion it no longer performed, and the space where sound once began. But it held those things without sorrow. Not everything is made to be eternal in function. Some things are meant to endure not by acting, but by existing, by standing where they always have, bearing witness to the passage of time without resistance. The bell had become such a thing. Its silence was not a void, but a settled presence. It no longer needed to prove that it had once mattered. It did not resist its stillness. In a way, it embraced it. A quiet dignity surrounded it, not noble, not heroic, just complete. The town around it moved gently through its rhythms. Shops opened and closed, meals were shared, and doors creaked on hinges that were oiled less and less each year. People passed milestones, births, deaths, and seasons. Life went on in the quiet pulse of repetition, and always, somewhere above it all, the bell hung an anchor with no rope, a sound that had already been spent. Even those who might one day wonder about it found their curiosity dissolving before it formed. There was something reassuring about the way the bell didn't ring. It made no demands. It marked no emergencies. It asked nothing of those who passed beneath it, and in that stillness, it became almost sacred. There are places in the world where silence is not absence but presence. The kind of silence that fills a room rather than empties it. The bell became part of that silence. It added to the weight of time in the village and gave shape to its passage. In the same way that shadows shape light or pauses shape speech, the bell's stillness gave meaning to the motion around it. Its non-action became a kind of slow echo, a quiet continuation of something no longer needed but never fully lost. If someone had tried to ring it now, it's not clear what would happen. Would the mechanism groan in protest? Would the sound burst forth, deep and resonant, startling birds from trees and pausing conversations mid-sentence? Or would it make no sound at all, the rope to brittle, the clapper to still? Maybe it was better not to know. Maybe its silence had become the truest form of what it was now meant to offer. Not communication, but presence. Not warning, but witnessing. Somewhere, deep in its metal, there might still be memory, not a memory of moments, but of motion, of vibration, of the way sound once moved through the world. That memory wasn't mournful. It was quiet, like dust that settles evenly over things no longer touched, or like the way light bends around something forgotten but still standing. The bell held its history not as a burden, but as a simple fact of its being, and so the bell remained. It did not ask to be noticed. It did not feel neglected. Its stillness was its offering now. It had done its work, and now its work was to stay still, to endure without explanation, to witness without sound, to remain even when the records of why it had been made were long gone, displays like so many other small details of history. It did not mourn its lost purpose, because perhaps its true purpose was never the ringing but the lasting. In a world so eager to rush forward, to make noise, to prove worth through constant activity, the bell offered something different, something slower, something quieter, a kind of permission not to be useful anymore and still be valid. A bell that no longer rang, yet still stood, became a symbol of how things can persist beyond their use, how stillness can be a final act of grace, how fading isn't always forgetting, it can be remembering, too, just without words or weight. And in the end, maybe the bell's purpose was always this, not to be wrong, but to be remembered not in loud clamor, but in quiet glances and the calm acceptance of what is past. Maybe its sound had only ever been a prelude to its silence, and now, in its stillness, it sang one last song, soft, steady, and complete. There is a kind of sound that lives in the threshold between memory and presence. It is not constant, not persistent, and not loud. It does not barge in or declare itself boldly. It does not ask for anything. It simply rings, quietly, unexpectedly, at odd intervals, often when the air feels stillest, when time itself seems to be folding gently into itself. This ringing, whether of a forgotten bell, an old phone, a distant chime, or a metaphorical echo, serves as a gentle rupture in a landscape otherwise defined by quiet endurance. And still, sometimes, it rang. There are places in the world where time seems to have settled down, like dust on an unused table. In such places, things are not abandoned exactly, but preserved by routine absence. There is no one to wind the clocks, no one to straighten the picture frames, and no one to check whether the doors creak more than they used to. These spaces breathe in long silences, and they exhale an almost imperceptible shift settling wood, fluttering curtains, and the slow contraction of materials as the weather changes. And among all of this, the sound comes again, a ring, faint and unmistakable. Like memory brushing the fabric of the present, it may have once been a bell above a shop door, rung every time someone came in looking for warmth or something simple, a loaf of bread, a word of kindness, a letter they had been waiting for. Perhaps it was once attached to a schedule, marking time in a school or a church or a household. Perhaps it was the chime of a mechanical clock that no longer ticks. But now, divorced from purpose, it still rings. Not regularly, not out of need, not to announce anything. It rings because it remembers. There is a haunting gentleness in that. Not the frightening kind of haunting, but the kind that feels like a hand once held, like laughter you didn't realize you missed until it returned in a dream. It's a sound that reminds you that something was once important here, that someone once waited for that ring or responded to it. And though no one is waiting anymore, and perhaps no one responds, the ringing still sometimes comes, as if it, too, cannot quite forget. Imagine someone once lived in that place. Maybe they were the type to light candles even when there was enough daylight. Maybe they had a favorite chair by the window, from which they watched the seasons blur together. Maybe the ring meant the mail had arrived, or someone had come to visit, or dinner was ready, or something small but lovely had happened. And now, though the window sits dusty and the chair holds only shadows, the bell rings softly, occasionally, almost apologetically, and still, sometimes, it rang. This is not about the sound itself. It is about what it interrupts. Silence is not empty. After all, silence is full of everything that could be said, but isn't. Silence holds presence in ways sound often cannot. When something rings in that silence, it creates a shape in the stillness, a pocket of attention. It makes the air lean toward it, if only for a second. And that moment is heavy with meaning, especially when there's no one to assign it. What does it mean for something to continue when nothing else does? The ring persists while the routine has vanished. It marks a time that is no longer observed. It lives beyond its function. And maybe that's the point. Not all things that remain need a reason. Some continue simply because they haven't yet stopped. There's a strange comfort in that. That something doesn't depend on us to exist. That even when we are gone or have moved on or forgotten, some things remain. Their persistence is a kind of quiet loyalty, like a door that never fully shuts, or a light that always flickers on just before the room gets to dark, or a ring that still echoes in empty air, asking no questions and expecting no response. Sometimes we are that bell. Sometimes something inside us rings not out loud, but in a memory or a dream or a sudden thought that feels like it came from far away. We might be walking down a street or stirring a cup of tea or standing in front of a mirror, and something in us rings. An old longing, a forgotten name, a quiet ache, and we don't know why, but it's their dotted lives. It remembers, and still, sometimes, it rings. It's also possible that this ring was once ignored, that someone meant to fix it, or silence it, or take it down, but they never got around to it, not out of negligence, but because there was always something else to do, or because they thought, maybe, the sound might be needed again. They left it and then left themselves, and now it exists outside of decision. No one maintains it. It maintains itself. Its ringing is not precise, it is not tied to the hour, but it is consistent in its inconsistency. Like the way certain memories only return in specific kinds of weather. There's something deeply human about the idea of a forgotten bell still ringing. We build so much and then forget it. We make routines and abandon them. We love and lose and leave and sometimes come back, but not always. And the world doesn't erase us. Not completely. It leaves marks, echoes, sounds. And sometimes it leaves a ring that continues even when all other sounds have fallen away. Think of a hallway where footsteps haven't been heard in years. Think of dust motes floating where voices once laughed. Think of letters tucked in drawers no one opens. And now imagine that in that quiet, in that surrender to stillness, a bell chimes. Not to wake anyone, not to ask anything, just to say, something was here, and maybe still is. That kind of continuity is delicate. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't require explanation. It just needs enough quiet for the ring to be heard. Which means the world, chaotic as it often is, still makes room for moments like this. Spaces where a faint sound can still matter. Where time doesn't erase but pauses. The ringing might be misheard as nothing by most people. They might shrug it off, dismiss it, not even notice. But to someone listening, truly listening, it might feel like the past gently tapping on the present's shoulder. A soft knock, a small song, and still, sometimes, it rang. If you stand still long enough, really still, you might hear the echoes of your own life in the quiet. You might recognize your own small rings. Things you once believed would fade. A thought you had when you were 12. A goodbye you never said. A kindness you once gave without knowing why. They're not gone. Not entirely. They're just waiting for the quiet to be heard again. Sometimes we wait for the ring. Sometimes we forget it exists. But when it comes, it's never quite what we expect. It might be soft, almost uncertain, but it finds its way through. It always has. Not every ring must announce. Some are meant only to remind. There is poetry in that kind of endurance. There's comfort in knowing that not all things must end with ceremony. Some things just linger. They hum in the quiet. They ring, not to be heard, but simply because they were made to do so. And though no one has listened for a long time, that doesn't stop them. They do not depend on attention to be true. What would happen if the ring stopped entirely? If the silence became absolute? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps no one would notice. But perhaps, too, the world would feel just a little more hollow. As if a stitch in its fabric had finally come undone. As if a sound that didn't ask to be remembered had nonetheless made itself necessary. So let it ring. Let it be there. Occasionally, softly, faithfully. Let it come and go without pattern. Let it be the thing that does not end. Not yet. Not completely. Because there is peace in knowing that even in a world that forgets, not everything is lost. Not everything fades entirely. Some things still ring, and still, sometimes, it rang. There was a time before the first ring, but it is not remembered. Not clearly. Anyway, it lives now in faint impressions like the scent of something burned long ago or the dust imprint left after a painting is taken down from the wall. What we do know is that the first ring wasn't announced. That is to say, it happened not with ceremony, nor with heraldry, nor with any of the markings of intention. It did not belong to a moment of declaration. Instead, it simply occurred sudden and without demand, as if the bell had grown tired of silence and wished to stretch its voice into the air, just once. When something happens unannounced, it reshapes the nature of time around it. Time becomes not linear, but startled. There is a before, and then there is an after. But no one quite remembers the transition. The moment of sound slips through memory like water through fingertips. It rings and then it's already fading. In this case, the first ring felt less like a beginning and more like a realization of something already underway. Not the striking of a match, but the sudden recognition that something is already burning. The bell, hanging where sky met stone, had waited patiently or indifferently. No one could say. Some might believe it was dormant, like a creature in winter sleep. Others say it was always awake, simply quiet, and that its silence was not absence but restraint. When it finally rang, it wasn't because someone gave it permission. It wasn't summoned by the expectations of a crowd or the strictures of a schedule. It rang because it did, and doing that unceremonious beginning, meant that no one was truly prepared for it. There was no one waiting at the edge of a crowd to whisper, "Here it comes." There was no soft hush of anticipation, no trumpet's prelude, and no lifting of eyes toward the tower. There was no context, just the bell and then the sound. Those who heard it would later describe it in curious ways. It sounded like something waking up, one said, though they couldn't explain what. Like metal remembering its metal, said another, their face distant, as if still trying to recall more. But mostly, people struggled to describe it at all, because the first ring did not invite description. It wasn't meant to be captured in language. It was something you experienced only in passing something that arrived already leaving. Perhaps that is why it stayed with them, not as a sound, precisely, but as a sensation. The way one might recall the moment before rain, when the pressure shifts and the air leans in close. That's what the first ring was like, a shift, a fold, something rearranged just slightly, but permanently. It did not echo not the way people expected. It didn't bounce from wall to wall, gathering force as it traveled. It landed softly, like a thought no one had yet admitted having. A single sound, cast like a pebble in the still water. There was no splash, just widening rings, invisible but felt. And because it wasn't announced, no one could agree on whether it meant anything. Some thought it signaled the return of something long forgotten. Others believed it marked a change yet to come. A few were content to think it meant nothing at all, that it was just the bell doing what bells do. But there was a difference between a bell being rung and a bell ringing. The former required a hand, an act, and an intent. The latter carried no such requirements. It can happen without touch, without motive, without warning, and so the first ring remained unclaimed. No one stepped forward to say, "I did that." No mechanism was blamed. No weather event explained it away. It was as if the bell had rung itself. And what kind of bell does that? It is not the kind of bell built for utility, not one used to summon laborers, or mark the hour, or call the faithful to prayer. No, this bell had a different kind of presence. It was the sort of object that belonged more to time than to function. It did not need to earn its place by usefulness. Its mere being was enough. The tower it hung in had long stopped being visited. The stone steps leading to it were worn in places no foot had touched in years. Dust gathered freely, untroubled. Birds made homes in the beams. Ivy traced the outer wall like handwriting no one could read. Still, the bell remained. And then, one day, it rang. What followed wasn't panic. It wasn't a celebration, either. It was something quieter, more internal. People paused, but not in alarm. They paused like someone pausing mid-sentence, uncertain if they'd just heard something or imagined it. That was the nature of the first ring. It lived at the edge of certainty. Later, some would question whether they had heard it at all. Others would swear it happened in a dream. A few would claim it had rung at dusk. Others said just before dawn. The details diverged, but what they shared was a strange sense of having been gently nudged, as if the world had shifted mentally to the left and left no trace of its doing so. And places like this, old places that wear time like a second skin, meaning is not always tied to explanation. A bell that rings unannounced is not a problem to be solved. It is not broken machinery or a ghost story waiting to be told. It is more like a reminder that some things, some moments, exist outside of the frame we use to understand them. The bell rang, and no one asked it to. That is all, and that is everything. Because in that simple, solitary act, it unsettled the silence. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to remind the world that silence, too, is alive and that sometimes it needs to be stirred. There are those who would say that everything must have a cause, that the bell could not have rung without some force, some trigger. But perhaps the better question is not what caused it, but what was caused by it. What memory stirred? What path diverged? What thought, long buried, rose quietly to the surface? When the first ring wasn't announced, it became legend without trying to be. Not because it was grand, not because it was loud, but because it was unclaimed. Because no one expected it. Because no one could repeat it. A second ring might come, or it might not, but it would never be the first. The first belongs only to itself, to that single moment in time when the air shifted and the sound entered quietly in, without echo. Kept going. If anyone had been tasked with ringing it, they would have told you what time they pulled the rope and how it felt in their hands. But there is no such testimony. The bell rang, and the world was just a little different afterward. That is the record. And what's more, because the first ring wasn't announced, it didn't have to justify itself. It didn't owe anyone a pattern or reason. It was not bound to recurrence. It wasn't tied to a ritual. It was a one-time gesture, a shrug, a whisper, a breath let out after holding it for too long. There's a strange kind of beauty in that, and something that simply happens once and is enough. A single note hung in the air. It didn't crescendo. It didn't repeat. It didn't ask for remembrance. And yet here we are, remembering it. In the years since, the bell has remained silent. Or perhaps it hasn't, and no one's been listening. Or perhaps it has rung again, but not in the way anyone expected. A sound doesn't always have to travel through air to be real. Sometimes it echoes through thought instead. Still, there is something about the first that lingers. The first step on a forgotten path. The first crack in a long set wall. The first rain after drought. The first ring of a bell that had waited so long that no one thought it would ever speak again. And when it did, it needed no introduction, no audience, no fanfare. It needed only to be heard. The silence that followed was not passive. It did not arrive as an absence, nor was it a mere vacancy left behind by noise. It did not fall like a curtain or evaporate like steam. It came with its own presence, a presence that demanded nothing but somehow held everything. It did not recede into the corners of the room or leave the air hollow. Instead, it spread itself out slowly and deliberately, like someone laying a cloth over the entire space, covering not just sound, but memory, thought, anticipation, and all the little echoes that had nowhere else to go. There is a kind of silence that merely follows noise, an obedient hush that enters once the music stops or the shouting dies down. But this was not that. This was a silence that had been waiting, not one that had been surprised. It did not seem startled by the sudden vacancy. Rather, it seemed to take its rightful place, as if it had been there all along, just beneath the surface. All it needed was for everything else to fall away so it could be noticed. In many ways, this silence was not simply the lack of sound. It was not a pause. It was an arrival, a hush. Yes, but not a hollow one. It felt like it carried weight, not a heavy, oppressive kind of weight, but a fullness. Like a presence that had no shape, no scent, and no voice, but made itself known anyway. It settled in the bones and behind the eyes. You could feel it in the pulse at your wrist or the space between heartbeats. It was alive, not loud, not vibrant, but undeniably alive. It wasn't there to comfort, nor was it there to menace. It did not soothe, but it did not provoke. It held the room in its own rhythm, one that did not ask for participation, but still wrapped everything inside it. The silence did not wait for anyone to speak. It was not anticipating a break. There was no need for interruption. The silence had no beginning and no planned end. It had simply arrived or revealed itself, and it remained. It had patience, that silence, the kind of patience that exists outside of time. It did not tap its foot or count the moments as they passed. It simply endured with a kind of elegant stillness that did not need justification. And as it lingered, it began to shape everything else. The air shifted. The walls seemed closer. Even the dust took on a different texture. Time, if it was still ticking at all, seemed to move sideways rather than forward. It did not feel like a lull. It felt like something greater had taken over. This silence had memory. Not the sharp, stinging memory of words or voices or shouted goodbyes, but a more ancient kind. It remembered what had once been said in this room, long after even the walls forgot. It remembered the small creak in the floorboard, not because it had heard it, but because it had been there when the creak was first born. It remembered the sighs and laughter and half-finished thoughts. The silence did not compete with them. It absorbed them, carried them forward, and then laid them gently down. It's easy to think of silence as passive, something that simply occurs when nothing else does. But that would be to miss the truth of it. This silence had character. It wasn't still because it couldn't move. It was still because it had chosen not to. It was a stillness that came from confidence, not lack. The kind of stillness found in deep water or ancient stone. The kind that doesn't move because it doesn't need to prove anything. And as it lingered, it asked strange things of you, not out loud, of course, but in the quiet pull at your spine, the slight quickening of your breath. It asked you to notice things you had long forgotten, the way your own footfall changed, depending on your pace, the way light curled around the edges of things when left uninterrupted, and the soft friction between thought and feeling when no voice intrudes. It reminded you of everything you'd pushed aside in the noise, and it didn't do this with urgency or drama. It simply waited for you to see. Some silences echo. This one didn't. It didn't need to. There was no sound left to reflect, only feeling. It didn't try to fill the space. It became the space. It didn't step forward. It enveloped. And inside that envelope, strange things began to breathe again. Half-formed thoughts, moments never given voice, and fears you'd almost grown used to. They didn't leap forward, they merely stirred, as if the silence had given them permission, or simply reminded them that the world was still turning. There are silences that feel like holding your breath. This one didn't. This one breathed. It inhaled everything around it, the weight of the walls, the bend of light, the slowness of time, and exhaled calm. Not peace. Not necessarily serenity, but a calm born of recognition. The silence didn't pretend it had answers, but it offered a place where questions could land and stay. It allowed for not knowing, and in doing so, it became not empty, but expansive. Nothing moved, but everything felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because the silence made everything more visible, more noticeable. It was as if the very edges of things had become clearer. You could see the outline of the world without its noise. The edges of your own thoughts were no longer blurred by distraction. You noticed the temperature of the room, the exact color of light, and the angle of your own posture. The silence had gently invited you to notice, and once you did, you realized it had been waiting for you all along. It had no judgment, no instruction. It didn't offer guidance or redirection. It simply held space. It let everything be as it was. And in that allowance, in that soft and watchful permission, there was something deeply grounding, as if the silence had come not to take anything away, but to return something that had been lost under the clamor, something small and quiet and essential, something you hadn't until you realized you'd missed, until it was back in your hands, without fanfare. There is a silence that follows endings, but there is another kind that lives beyond the idea of ending altogether. That was this silence. Not a reaction, not a result, but a state of being. It was not here because something had stopped. It was here because it had always been, and only now could it be seen, like stars uncovered after a power outage, revealed not by their arrival, but by the absence of what once concealed them. If you stayed in it long enough, you might forget how long you've been there. You might stop measuring time in seconds or minutes and instead begin to notice rhythms. The way your breath moved, the way your shoulders settled, and the slight hum of your own presence. The silence did not intrude. It did not isolate. It did not even beckon. It simply allowed. It let you belong to it if you chose to. And once you recognized that, something shifted. Not loudly, not even consciously, but something in your bones began to adjust. You realized that noise had never truly protected you. That distraction had never really filled the gap. That even the most constant sound could not do what this silence did. Offer you a mirror that didn't distort, a space that didn't rush, a presence that didn't flee. The silence was not a void. It was not empty air. It was not absence. It was not waiting for noise to return. It had no plans for what came next. It simply was. And in its presence, you could begin again or not. You could rest or not. You could speak or not. The silence made no demands, but it made everything else possible. Because in that still, non-passive hush, you were reminded of something vital. That being does not require doing. That presence does not need performance. That sometimes, to be quiet is not to vanish, but to fully exist. This silence, then, was not a break in the music. It was the space that made music possible. It was not what followed, it was what endured. Long after voices stopped, after footsteps faded, after candles burned down, the silence was still there. Not because it had come, but because it had always been. And now, in this moment, it had finally been seen. There is a subtle but enduring power in the passage of time, of force that is not necessarily cruel, but certainly indifferent. When we speak of those who once heard the bell being long gone, we are not simply making a factual observation about mortality or absence. We are speaking to a broader kind of silence, the kind that builds slowly, layer by layer, until it is no longer the result of a quiet moment, but a state of existence. The phrase implies a time long after memory has faded, after stories have softened into myth or disappeared entirely. It suggests a world where the bell still stands, maybe even still rings, but its sound is no longer heard with familiarity. No one recognizes it. No one waits for it. No one wonders when it will ring again. And more poignantly, no one remembers what it once meant. To say those who once heard it were long gone is to admit that the chain of living memory has broken. Not just that the individuals who once turned their heads at the sound of the bell are gone, but that their knowledge, the context, the understanding, the reflex has vanished with them. When a sound continues but its listeners do not, the sound becomes ghost-like. It becomes part of the architecture rather than part of the life within it. The bell might still ring out, but it no longer reaches anyone in the way it used to. Its tone might be crisp, resonant, even beautiful, but it is functionally unheard. And so we're left with an object and a sound divorced from their original purpose. There may be records somewhere, perhaps misfiled or misplaced, as other passages have suggested. Or there may be none. The bell, like an actor whose audience has departed, remains on stage, still capable of performing but without anyone to understand the performance. There's something haunting in that idea, not eerie in the traditional sense, but quietly disorienting. The bell is still true to itself, but the world no longer shares in that truth. We can imagine that once, a long time ago, the bell signified something important. Perhaps it marked the beginning of a gathering, or served as a warning of distant danger, or told farmers it was time to return from the fields. Perhaps it was ceremonial, a call to worship, a declaration of peace, a mark of mourning. Its purpose, in any of those cases, would have been deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life. People would have oriented themselves around its voice. They would have responded instinctively, perhaps even reverently. A sound like that can become woven into a culture's rhythms, its habits, and its memories. But all cultures, like all people, are vulnerable to time. Practices evolve, tools get replaced, priorities shift, generations hand off their traditions. And sometimes those traditions land safely in the arms of those who come after, but sometimes they fall. Sometimes they are dropped without even realizing it, because no one recognizes that a particular moment was the last. Maybe someone meant to teach the next generation what the bell meant, but got distracted. Or maybe they assumed someone else had already done it. Or maybe the world simply changed too fast, and what once mattered began to seem unnecessary, outdated, and even a little embarrassing. And so the bell continued to exist, but the people who gave it meaning did not, and the meanings they once held evaporated, as such things often do, quietly and without ceremony. The loss of memory is rarely marked. No one wakes up and announces that today is the day something will be forgotten forever. It just happens gradually, invisibly, until one day someone walks by the bell and wonders aloud what it was for. That moment of wondering is important. It's a soft kind of grief, a subtle acknowledgement that something has slipped beyond reach. You can imagine someone stopping under the bell's frame, maybe brushing away cobwebs, maybe listening to the wind whistle through the metalwork and saying, "I wonder what this was used for." And if they ask an elder, they might hear a story, or they might hear nothing. It's just always been there. The elder might say, "I suppose it meant something once," and that would be the end of it. A vague recognition of absence, but not enough momentum to bring the meaning back. When those who once heard it are long gone, the sound no longer travels the same way. It becomes muffled by time, not in decibels, but in relevance. The bell may still toll, and birds may still scatter from the trees, and animals may still pause in the underbrush. But the human world, the world that once shaped itself around that sound, remains unmoved. It doesn't notice, it doesn't listen. But the bell, being what it is, does not stop ringing. It was made to speak, and so it speaks. Perhaps not every day, but often enough to prove it still can. And in that there is something both beautiful and sorrowful. Beauty in the resilience of function. This object is still doing what it was made to do. Sorrow in the disappearance of its audience. To reflect on this condition is to think about all the other things in our lives that may outlast us, or even our memory. The handwriting in the margins of an old book. A coat hung behind a door no one uses anymore. A lockbox with a key long misplaced. These things do not lose their value, they lose their context. And without context, their meaning changes. Not to nothing, necessarily, but to something unknown. The unknown can be fascinating, of course, but it can also be isolating, particularly when the unknown thing was once so central, so trusted. There's also a sense of stillness here, not stagnation, but the stillness that follows departure. Not a noisy end, but a quiet trailing off. Think of a room once used for music, now silent. The dust doesn't erase the echoes, but it does settle between them. The bell stands like that, perhaps high on a tower or nestled in a grove where no paths remain. Its metal is dulled. Birds perch on it. Moss climbs the stones beneath it. It waits. Not expectantly, because it doesn't know to wait. It simply remains. And this remaining, this presence after purpose, is what gives the phrase "those who once heard it were long gone" its real weight. It's not about the bell sound going silent. It's about the bell being the last witness to a tradition, a memory, and a rhythm that no longer exists. It's about being the sole survivor of a shared understanding. The sound it makes may be identical to what it once was, but what has changed is the ear that once received it, and more importantly, what the ear once did with it. The cultural infrastructure that once supported the bell's meaning is gone. There are no children being taught to listen for it. No elders telling stories about what it meant. No communal pause when it rings. Only sound moving through air, unclaimed. This doesn't make the bell meaningless, but it does make it unmoored, detached from time, from purpose, from people. It becomes a kind of quiet monument, not to what was remembered, but to what was forgotten. It has the stone you trip over because it used to be the foundation of something but now lies scattered. It's the final syllable of a language that is no longer spoken. It still exists, but in isolation. And isolation changes everything. Still, there is dignity in endurance. There is a strange nobility in the bell continuing to ring even when no one hears. Because somewhere in that ringing is a record. Not written, not read, but felt. A kind of sonic fossil. And maybe, just maybe, someday someone will not only wonder about the bell, but also try to learn more. Maybe they will research, or dig through archives, or listen for patterns. Maybe a piece of its story will resurface, however small. And in that moment, the gap between the past and the present will be bridged just for a moment. Just enough to suggest that no sound is ever truly lost, only delayed in being understood again. Until then, the bell will remain, not out of defiance, not out of sorrow, but simply because that is what it does. It was made to be heard, and so it continues even in the absence of listeners. And we, as passersby or descendants or caretakers of the land, may never truly understand what it once meant. But we can recognize that it did mean something, that others once responded to it, that they shaped their days by it, and that they, like the sound, have moved into the realm of memory and echo. In this way, the phrase "those who once heard it were long gone" becomes not just a statement about disappearance, but about continuity and absence. It's about how the world goes on not always knowing what was lost, but carrying the traces of it nonetheless. A bell that still rings, a sound that still travels, a history that, though unspoken, still lingers in the air. There was something about dusk that remained stubbornly dependable, no matter how the world changed through years of joy, of silence, of rebuilding or forgetting. The dusk returned like a quiet visitor who didn't need an invitation. It did not arrive with grandeur or announcement. There was no trumpet in the clouds or vivid fanfare. It simply slipped in quietly and gradually, painting the corners of the sky with tones that felt like softened memory, faded lavender, dimming coral, the hush of muted blue. The sky would shift as if exhaling, as though it had been holding its breath all day and had finally decided to let go. This was the time of day when the bell had once spoken, not loudly, not sharply, but with a calm authority that reached out across rooftops, down moss-covered lanes, into homes where people paused not because they were told, but because the bell asked gently. Its voice was not one of command, but of presence, a reminder, a boundary between light and dark, activity and rest, speaking and listening. But now, the bell stayed silent, and it had been silent for so long that many had forgotten it had ever spoken. Still, dusk continued. The sun dipped, predictably, behind the hills it had always known, while shadows stretched out like tired limbs seeking a place to rest. The warmth lingered a little in the air, not because of the sun's loyalty, but because heat clung to stone and wood and whispered its way out slowly, as if reluctant to leave. Trees stood in their places, unchanged by the absence of sound. The breeze did not ask questions. Even the birds adjusted, calling in their evening voices without any cue from above. The bell tower itself was not neglected, exactly. It stood with the patient grace of things built before urgency became fashionable. The stones were old but not crumbling. Moss grew in small, polite patches. The wooden steps inside no longer remembered many footsteps. But they did not resent it. They held themselves upright like they always had, creaking now and then not for attention, but just because time still moved through them. And at the top, the bell, unswung, untouched, not broken, just still. No one had declared that the bell must stop ringing. No ribbon was tied around its tongue. No decree had been passed. It had simply ceased one day. Perhaps the rope had snapped and no one thought to replace it. Or maybe the person who had always pulled it moved away quietly, assuming someone else would take up the task. But no one did. The bell did not protest. It did not rust out of spite. It waited, without complaint, as dusk came again and again and again like a wave brushing the same shoreline, knowing it would never be noticed. At first, some noticed the silence. They looked up at the tower with furrowed brows and hesitated at their windows. Children asked questions, and elders offered vague answers. Perhaps it's being clean, or maybe they ring it less often now. But over the weeks and months, the questions became fewer, the hesitation shorter. A pause became a shrug. The shrug became a forgetting. But dusk noticed, not because dusk needed the bell. It had never required an announcement. The sky did not need sound to change color. The air did not depend on vibration to grow still. But dusk had developed a quiet relationship with the bell. Not a dependency, not a friendship, something softer, a parallel rhythm, like the boats drifting along the same current, not tied together, but always nearby. The silence where the bell once was did not hurt. It wasn't painful, it wasn't tragic, But it was noticeable in that small way you notice when something is missing from a familiar view, like a book gone from a shelf you don't remember using, like a key no longer left by the door. It didn't demand grief, but it invited noticing, a small, quiet acknowledgement that something used to be here. Something once had a reason to speak in now. It chooses not to, or is forgotten now. The bell itself did not mourn its purpose. It had been made to ring, yes, but its identity was not wrapped so tightly around the action that silence made it lesser. It existed. It bore the marks of seasons and stood with the stillness of a thing that had learned to listen instead. Even now, birds sometimes perched upon it, and the wind moved around its form, humming through the gaps with a song only the air could understand. In its stillness, the bell had become a different kind of presence. And below, people adjusted. Evening rituals changed in subtle ways. Where once they paused at the bell's call, now they glanced at the dimming sky, or watched the way the light shifted across the floorboards. Meals were served not because a bell summoned them, but because stomachs noticed the hour. Doors were latched not at the sound, but at the look of the sky. The world continued, gently adapting as it always does. Yet, in some quiet way, the bell's silence had not gone unnoticed by everything. Cats paused a moment longer on garden walls, eyes fixed on the tower as if sensing the absence more sharply than humans did. Dust floated a little differently in the tower's air, undisturbed by the motion that used to stir it. And sometimes, when dusk was particularly golden and the breeze came from the west, there was a feeling, not a sound, but a feeling that something might ring again. That the air remembered what resonance used to feel like. But no sound came. Not because it couldn't, because it didn't need to. Silence had become the bell's new language, and dusk faithful as ever accepted it. Some evenings, someone walking the path beside the tower might pause. An old person, perhaps, with a memory tied loosely to sound. Or a child with a question they didn't quite know how to ask. They might look up and wonder, why doesn't it ring anymore? They might not ask aloud, but the thought would hang gently in the air for a few breaths. The bell would not answer, and that too was part of its role now, to be present, to be visible, to invite wonder, but not to explain. There was no plaque beneath the tower, no history carved into the stone. If there had been a record once, it had been left in drawers that no one opened anymore, or written in a journal whose pages were used to wrap fruit decades ago. No one remembered who last rang it. No one knew the original reason it was built. It didn't matter. It had been there long enough to belong, and its silence had lasted long enough to be respected. The ring didn't return, but it didn't have to. The absence was not a hole, it was a shape of its own, a contour in the daily rhythm, a pause that made other sounds feel clearer. The creak of wood, the sigh of air, the settling of stone. Dusk returned every day. The sky dimmed. Lamps were lit. Windows glowed. Somewhere, a kettle began to hum, and the bell still and silent watched it all, not with longing, not with sorrow, but with the stillness of something that no longer needed to be what it once was to still be whole. And so dusk came, again and again, and the bell remained, and the ring did not.